So we're coming now in our series of studies as we try to make our way through the Old Testament in time to get to Jesus for Christmas. And we've come now to look at the life of David and consider the kings that Israel had in general. So a general look at the kingships of Israel and looking especially at David. And before we begin, I want to recap the story so far. And the purpose of this recapping is not simply to try and fill some time, but so that we understand that these are not isolated stories. They're all part of God's greater story. And they're all looking to solve a fundamental problem with humanity. Because we saw that God made a good world and he showed us what the good life was like with when we lived in a loving relationship with God as our God and each other as equals and the world for us to live and work in. And this situation was lost when humanity turned away from God and did what it thought was right in its own eyes. Because of this, sin entered the world and sin separated us from God. And with sin then came the curse. And so humanity has this fundamental problem of being separated from the love of God. This didn't happen by accident. God allowed it so that we may learn the seriousness of sin and see God's justice in punishing it. And so the question we face now is, how do we get back into this relationship with God? And how do we learn the lessons that he wants us to learn through history? The flood showed us that God is going to cleanse the world of sin and create a new world for his people. From Abraham, we saw that God calls his people out of the world to live in a life of faith. And with the life of Joseph, we saw that God uses the sin and the evil actions in the world for his own purposes. And with Moses, we saw how God rescues his people from the slavery of sin to live in a new and holy way of life and lead them onto a journey to a new and promised land. As we come now to consider the life of David, the question I really want us to ask ourselves is, what authority are we looking to in our lives? What do we treat as the king? What is ruling over us? So we're going to quickly look at the bit of the background of how we got from the situation of Moses, where we left off, to the situation of David. And then we're going to have an overview of the life of David before looking at the fact that the character of the king leads the people. And then considering at more length why we need a king. So, just a bit of background. After Moses had died, the children of Israel had entered the promised land under the leadership of Moses' successor, Joshua. However, Joshua did not establish a political dynasty with another successor, leading on to a line of successors. But rather, once the conquest had been as completed as it was, the tribes all went their own way and became essentially autonomous, although they were still linked and communicated with each other. And the conquest had not been completed. There were still the original inhabitants left in pockets throughout the land. Therefore, after Joshua died, it ended up with a fragmented system, with the children of Israel being under threat from those around them and about them. And this was the beginning of the period known as the Judges. And essentially, the Israelites went through approximately 40-year cycles of drifting away from God into disobedience and then being punished and then repenting and God raising up a judge to deliver the people. Then the judge would die, and in time the cycle would start again. and this lasted for about 300 years. It's important to note that although when we read the Book of Judges, it seems like the children were constantly in a state of rebellion, in fact, there were periods of obedience that a more careful reading reveals. This was the situation that Samuel was born into. And Samuel, in some ways, was the last of the judges, and also was the first to fulfill the role of the prophet who gave God's word to the kings, as well as acting as a priest. As Samuel got on in his life and it came time for him to pass on the duties, he was going to pass on those duties to his two children. But the children of Israel rejected this because his children were not moral and upstanding, and he was. And they demanded that Samuel give them a king. I always think there's a slight irony here that they were rejecting the succession of a father to son, and instead they wanted to impose a hereditary monarchy, which seems to me to not really be learning the lesson that sons do not always necessarily follow their fathers. Just because the father's good does not mean the son will be. Samuel appointed Saul as the king, and Saul initially was granted with approval. He looked the part, and he also appeared to start off humble, and so he seemed like the ideal candidate. But in time he sinned against God and moved away and did what he thought was right rather than doing what God had instructed him. And so God declared that he was going to take the kingdom away and give it to someone whose heart was like God, who followed God. And his choice was David. Now David had been born into obscurity. He was the youngest of 8 sons, and he was initially viewed as too unimportant to be presented to Samuel when Samuel came to the feast. So when Samuel anointed him, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David, and this led to David having some renown, so that when Saul's servants were looking for someone to calm the rages that Saul would get into, they recommended a musician. When Saul asked them who they would recommend, they said, "Behold, I have seen the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, that he is a cunning in playing, and a mighty man of valour, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him." Now, here Saul's servant was possibly exaggerating a little to get Saul's approval, as David had not yet had a chance to prove himself at war or in other matters. And so, for a time, David enters Saul's service, and he would play music for him when Saul would get into a temper, and this would calm Saul down. However, in time he went back to his brothers, and then the Philistines invaded, and we have the famous episode of how David killed Goliath. And from this episode we see that David's brothers were clearly resenting some of the fame and attention that David was getting, even before he had killed Goliath. After he had killed Goliath, David entered Saul's service permanently and befriended Saul's son Jonathan. However, Saul became jealous of David's fame, and in an evil temper he threw a javelin at David. And over time, Saul's hatred of David grew from attempting to kill him in fits of temper into deliberate plans to kill him. Jonathan attempted to intervene and mediate, but ultimately his efforts failed. And it got to the point where Saul became so angry at Jonathan for his interventions, saying that didn't Jonathan know that if David was allowed to live, then his fame would grow and Jonathan would be deprived of the throne. And to show just how irrational Saul's temper had got, he then tried to throw a javelin at Jonathan. So David had to flee and eventually became a leader of a group of outlaws. There then proceeded a game of cat and mouse between Saul and David. On 2 occasions, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but didn't. This led to Saul temporarily repenting of his actions and recognizing that he did not need to kill David. In time, after several adventures, or perhaps we should say misadventures of David, Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle. And then David returned to Judah, where he was recognized as king. However, the rest of the tribes of Israel followed another of Saul's sons for 2 years. During this time there was fighting, betrayal and intrigue until Saul's son was assassinated, at which point the rest of Israel came together and submitted to David as their king. Being king over all Israel, David was able to secure the borders, but something David was not able to do was to build a temple for God, which he wanted to. This then was the height of David's position, and unfortunately he became complacent, and at a time when he should have gone out to war, he instead stayed at home, and there he saw another man's wife and lusted after her and lay with her. She then sent a message to him reporting that she was with child. David initially tried to cover up this sin, and when that failed, he ended up having her husband killed in what was made to appear to be an accident of war. And then he took the man's wife for his own. From this time onwards, David's rule began to unravel. There was a rebellion of his son, and there were various other problems which plagued the land. However, David was able to hand over the kingdom to his son Solomon, who then was able to live in great luxury and build a glorious temple for God. So that's a brief overview of the life of David. And the first thing I want us to notice is that the character of kings leads the people and can lead them astray or can lead them in the right path. In the period of Judges, there was a great deal of anarchy. What we are told is that in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did what was right in his own eyes. We read this in Judges 17 verse 16, and the point is also made at the chapters of 18 and 19, and again at the end of chapter 21, probably to explain the chaotic situations we find there, where people are taking justice into their own hands, and there seems very often to be a state of chaos and terrible things occurring. So there was a state of confusion with things going wrong without a king. However, things were not necessarily better when there was a king in place. We have seen how Saul, when he became king, he did lead the people into committing sins, and because of his mad outbursts, he led the kingdom into unnecessary conflicts with David and led to an irrational style of leadership. Then, under David did lead the people in the right path of God, but his sins also led to problems, and things only really started to go worse from there. David's son Solomon, although he started off wise and was surrounded by glory, yet he married many wives, and for these wives, which came from the surrounding kingdoms, each of them brought their own gods with them, and so he built places to worship for those gods. His heart was led away from the worship of the true God to worship these other gods that his wives had brought. And so this established a precedent of the kings bringing in the worship of foreign gods. And because of Solomon's abandoning of God, God said that the kingdom, or the main part of the kingdom, would be taken away from Solomon's heir. And so after Solomon died, the kingdom divided, with 2 tribes following the line of David, and the rest of the tribes going to establish their own kingdom. And the new king there, Jeroboam, although he had been promised the kingship by God, and God had promised to help him, yet he was worried that if the Israelites continued to go down to Jerusalem to worship, then their hearts would be turned away. So, as a political measure, he instituted a adapted religion where he set up calves for the children of Israel to worship, saying that they were the gods which had brought the people out of Egypt. So we see there that he is adapting religion for his own political purposes. His successors were even worse. Ahab in particular. Of him we read, "And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nahab, he took a wife Jezebel, the daughter of the Ethbaal king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal, and worshipped him, and he reared an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, and he built in Samaria, and Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him." So here Ahab is really turning away from God to worship the local deity. And this is angering God, and it's leading the people away into sin. It's true that a good king could lead the people towards God. Hezekiah, when he became king in Jerusalem, did a lot to clear away all the idols that had been raised and all the alternative worship places that had been erected for the people to go to. But his reforms were almost completely undone by his son Manasseh, who seduced the people and took them almost further away than ever from God. And so you see that when you have the human kings, when you have one king being succeeded by his son, you can end up with a real seesawing of effects as people are taken one way from another. And we can often feel like this as we look around the world at the moment, that one political regime comes in and tries to implement what they think is right, and then another one succeeds them and then tries to overturn everything. And even with the same government as we see at the moment, people just don't know where they are with the new rules and regulations that are being brought in. So when you have human in charge, you can end up with a chaotic system of people being led one way than another, and are more likely to be led away from God than towards him. It's important to note, though, that although the kings led the people away from God, this didn't take away the responsibility of the individual people. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13 to 14. "Now therefore, behold, the king whom ye have chosen, and whom ye have desired, and behold, the Lord hath set him over you. If ye will fear the Lord, and serve him, and obey his voice, and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then shall both ye and also the king that reigneth over you continue to follow the Lord your God." We see here that although the people are being given a king, God is still saying that it's your responsibility to follow me and obey the law. So this raises really 2 points for us. Firstly, what are we trusting in and what are we looking to as an authority? Because if we are ultimately looking to anything other than God, we are going to be led one way or another, and we will be led astray. And so we need to have God as the ultimate authority. But also we need not to try and hide behind things. We can't just say, well, this is what I was told to do by the person in authority over me. We are still morally responsible, and we still need to be able to account for our own actions. Moving on, I want to consider why a king is needed. Given all the political intrigue that we see comes with having a king, and given the fact that you are led one way or another, and just because the king at the moment's a good person doesn't mean his son will be, nor does it mean that his deputies are going to be. So given the problems that there is with having a king, why did the people want one in the first place? When the people came to Samuel and demanded a king, their reasons were that they wanted to be like the nations around us, to have a king to judge over them, that the king would go out before them and fight their battles. So we see here, there is a desire not to stand out and be different from the rest of the world, but to have the security that the rest of the world has. That they want authority over them to judge them, that's going to go out before them. In other words, an authority that they can see and they can understand the actions of. In these days when so many people seem so fond of rebelling, the idea of an authority can seem quite alien. But I think it is still important for humans to have something that they can look up to, someone that they can look and say, that is a person whose example I am following and whose instructions I want to keep. And also they want the security of a king to fight their battles. From this we see that having someone that you can look to gives a certain sense of security. However, this was a rejection of what God had offered them in the relationship that he had established under Moses, or through Moses. He had called them to be apart and distinct from the other nations around them. He had given them the law and the priests to judge over them in order to guide them. God had promised to go before them and to fight their battles for them. So all that they were asking to have a king for, God was already doing for them. Therefore, they were rejecting God as their king. And yet, this was always the plan of God. When Moses gave the law, this exact situation had been predicted, that the people would want a king set over them as the nations around them had. We find this in Deuteronomy chapter 17, where God had also given the instructions for what a good king would be like. So the king needed to come from among the people, to not be a foreigner. He also needed to learn and to follow the law of God. So he was not above the law, but needed to know it and to follow it and keep it close to him. He was also not to multiply on horses. He was not to return the people to Egypt and bring them back under the influence and bondage that they had escaped. Neither was he to get for himself a lot of wives and amass treasures, and neither was he to become arrogant. So what is going on here where, on the one hand, a king being appointed is part of God's plan, and yet at the same time, this marks a rejection of God and what he is providing the people? Well, although the people are rebelling, they are still working God's will. Remember when we looked at Joseph, we saw how God uses evil actions and intentions to work his purposes. And remember also that God is allowing various situations to arise in order for us to see their inadequacies. Just as the law was given to show that even with as good set of instructions, we cannot live up to it and we cannot live a righteous life to meet the requirements of the law. So too, here God is showing us that it is not enough to have God as our king in an abstract sense, to have God ruling over us from a distance. Humans need a king that they can see and look up to. So it was insufficient for the people to have God as their king. Remember when we looked at the life of Moses, we saw that God in his glory, it can't even be looked upon by man. And so God allowed them to have a king that they could look on. And first of all, he shows them what happens when a king is appointed who meets their requirements of what a good king should be. Saul looked the part, and he was even humble enough to try and hide away when he was called to be called the ruler. And this is quite an old and ancient stereotype that a person in authority should be a reluctant ruler, that anyone who rules shouldn't really want to rule, and the people who want to rule and be in power are a danger. And yet we saw that even though Saul met these requirements of the classically good king, yet he became a mad tyrant. And so God replaced him with a man who had a heart after God's own heart. And yet even David, who was presented as being among the very best of men, still failed. And it's easy to look at the crimes David committed and think, well, we would never do anything like that. We would never commit murder in order to cover up our adultery. But David did not set out to do this. First of all, David's fault was that he didn't fulfill the function of a king to go out to war. He instead tarried and took his leisure in Jerusalem for a while. This led to him seeing this lady whom he then lusted after, and then lust led to adultery, which then led to trying to cover up and lies, which then in turn led to murder when that failed. And so David started off by simply being a bit lazy and not fulfilling his duty. And then David committed crimes he thought he could get away with and tried to cover up. And to a certain extent, we all do this in our own small way. We all don't do everything we should do, and we are all led aside into sins which begin to multiply as we try to cover them up. And David, because of his situation, was able to end up with this very extreme crime, which many of us simply don't have the opportunity to commit. There's a saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I do not really think this is true though. I think power is actually neutral, is that when we have power, this allows for the corruption that we have inside to become evident. Had we been in the position that David had and the power he had, we may well have been led into the same sins he did. So God is showing us here that it's not enough to have God as our king because he is too remote. Humans need a king that they can see and interact with. But at the same time, all the human kings that we can see are fallible and will fail and lead us astray. Therefore, we need a king with the goodness of God, without the corruption of humans. But at the same time, we still need a human king whom we are able to relate to. And you can probably see where I'm going with this, that Jesus is the king we need. When his disciples asked Jesus to show them the Father, Jesus said that he who hath seen me hath seen the Father. In other words, to see Jesus is to see God. And Jesus fulfills the criteria set down for the good king in Deuteronomy, that he was a man of the people. He came to live as us humans, and so he knows what it is to be human. He can relate to us. He also followed the law all his life. He didn't have any special exceptions for himself, and he certainly did not amass for himself earthly military power, or wives, or treasure. Neither was he arrogant. In fact, he humbled himself and made himself the servant of those who should have been serving him. But wait a moment, you might be thinking. This situation is not really any better. Even if we believe that Jesus was fully God and that he was also a fully historical man, and even if you accepted that he died and rose again and ascended into heaven and is now at the right hand of God, even if you believe that he is coming again to fully establish his kingdom, that is not very helpful for the problem we have set out, because Jesus is still remote. We still cannot see him. We actually find the answer to this problem in what David wanted to do but could not do. David wanted to build a temple to God, and this was quite a natural impulse. Temples are one of the most common structures throughout history that you have. You have military structures, you have pleasure palaces, you have civilian areas, and you have temples. So it was quite natural for David to try and want to build a temple. And it is interesting that when David was explaining to other people why he was not allowed to build the temple, he emphasized the fact that he had been a man of blood and a man of war, and therefore he couldn't build God's temple for him. However, when we look at these records we have of David being told that he cannot build God a temple, the emphasis is rather different. God said when David says that he wants to build a temple is, why do you want to build me a house? Essentially, God says he is quite happy with the tabernacle he has been living in ever since the children of Israel were wandering in the desert. He's never asked for anyone to build him a house. And he says that he has raised David up to the position he is in. And he has established David and made David a house. And so everything that David has is given to him by God. So there is almost a bit of wordplay going on here, that God is saying, you want to build me a house? It's me who builds you a house. So we should not think that any of the houses we can build for God are adequate. Instead, it is God and Jesus who build a house for us. Jesus promised that in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Nevertheless, God did tell David that his son would build him a house. So what is going on here? That on the one hand, we seem to have it saying that God doesn't need a house, but at the same time, we have instructions that a house will be built for him by David's son. Well, the way David interpreted this in the immediate historical context was that his son Solomon would build a house. And David put a lot of effort into planning the house and into making all the preparations ready and all the music. So then that was the first temple that was built. And that temple was destroyed and then rebuilt. And then in the time of Jesus, the temple had been rebuilt again by Herod the Great. And when Jesus' disciples showed him the buildings of the temple and showed him how impressive they were, Jesus responded, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So when Jesus was shown all these impressive buildings, he's essentially saying, well, you may see them now, but ultimately they're going to be destroyed. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. And people look at this and interpret it as looking as a prediction of the destruction of the temple, which it is. But also we could say this of any of the great buildings, any of the cathedrals, castles, palaces, skyscrapers, or homes that we see. You could say of any building that it's not going to last, that ultimately it will be destroyed. And because of this apparent disrespect that Jesus and then his disciples showed for the temple, that the first Christian martyr was killed. This was Stephen, and it was witnessed against him that this man ceaseth not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we heard him say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and shall change all the customs Moses has delivered to us. And Stephen defended himself And he pointed out that actually the promises that God made, the promises that he had made to Abraham to give them a people and to bless the world through Abraham, they were all in place before the law or the temple. Therefore, this promise of God precedes the temple. And of the temple, Stephen said, "But Solomon built him a house. Howbeit, the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands. As saith the prophet, Heaven is thy throne, and the earth thy footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things?" So what is going on here? That apparently the physical temple is of very little importance, despite how impressive it was. Well, remember that the Old Testament is full of images of what is to come. When God said to David that his son would build a temple, we understand this as meaning David's greater son Jesus would build him a temple, and the temple that he was going to build would be the church. We read when Paul is addressing the church, "For ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And again we read in Ephesians, "Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, and of the household of God, and are built up upon the foundations of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, and in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are built together for an habitation of God through the Spirit." And when we consider what the temple was there for, the temple was there for a place to go to be near God, to hear his law, and to make sacrifices. Yet if we have the Holy Spirit living in us, then we don't need to go anywhere to be near to God. We have God with us always. And the Spirit reminds us of the law of God and brings the things that Jesus has said to our mind. As for offering sacrifices, it is our bodies that we are supposed to offer as living sacrifices in service to God. And therefore, our bodies serve the purpose that the temple did. And because we have God living in us, this then solves the problem of God being the only viable king, but also God being inaccessible. Because Jesus bridged that gap, and being God became man, and because of his actions enabled the Holy Spirit to come and live in us. Therefore, we have God ever near us. And yet, wonderful though this situation is, it too will be surpassed when in heaven we shall see Jesus face to face and be with God. We read in Revelation, "And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it." So in heaven there is no need of a meeting place for God, for we see him directly. In conclusion, let us say that until we reach that day, until we are in heaven and see God face to face, we need to ask ourselves, who or what are we trusting in now? What are we viewing as the authority in our lives? Because if it is a good authority, it will lead us in goodness, but if bad, it will lead us astray. And so therefore we need to make sure that we are trusting in a good authority, that we are looking to good examples to lead us. And the best example is the example Jesus has given to us in his loving sacrifice. When we look forward to that day when God will come again and we will see him face to face, do we look forward fearfully as rebellious subjects, knowing that we have not done what the king demands? Or do we look forward with joy, knowing that this situation which we have now will be replaced with one far better? And are we working now to be built up as part of the living temple Are we trying not to grieve the Spirit? Are we trying to work in accordance with the Spirit? Is our King living within us?